Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on classification of automobile parts. Classification in itself has been a very interesting and a disputable issue, not only in India and world, but worldwide. But in India, the issue gains more prominence because of the different rates which are attracted for different classification, which is probably not so across the world. So in India, you'll see a lot many more classification disputes that are happening. And in this webinar, we are focusing only on classification disputes vis-a-vis automobile parts because of the increasing rate arbitrage vis-a-vis these parts or goods and other goods which are there. So in this webinar, what we will be doing is we will be discussing the dispute and implications, just a background of why this dispute is coming, the test of classification. How do you identify, or let us say for any particular product, how can you determine what the classification is and what are the key tests which are there? Then some recent developments, I think all of us must be aware of the Supreme Court ruling of Westinghouse, post which this classification dispute surged a lot. So we'll discuss that ruling again, a lot of developments that have happened on that ruling itself, post the ruling, and some other new judgments post the ruling. Next would be our analysis of different parts. We'll be taking some sample parts and do analysis of ours, that how do you determine a classification. And then the way forward, it would be actually generate for both auto parts and non-auto parts, but considering the increasing implication for auto parts, more relevant for them in present times. Starting with the dispute and implications. So firstly, we ran a poll question to discuss whether there have been disputes from revenue regarding classification of goods. And we have seen almost an equal number of participants saying that they have faced a dispute and they have not faced a dispute. And the number is very candidly alarming because of the fact that classification has been in existence since long. It's not that only post GST this classification has come. So classification has been there. You have the latest tariff of customs, which is there, that is there since 1975. So even after so many years, that dispute of classification from revenue, even if 50% of the taxpayers are facing this, it is, I'll say, a alarming number that the clarity of classification has still not been attained. And whatever is being followed by the taxpayers, say, let us say in the present times, it might be a long-standing practice, is now being disputed by the department. So now understanding why this dispute is there and why there has been a further increase in these disputes in the past some time. So discuss this, there are two headings, or I'll say one heading and a residual category which may consider for this. One is that most of you must be aware that the parts and accessories of motor vehicles, they either fall under 8708 and or 8714. For motorcycles, it is 8714, and for others, it is 8708. And then you have many other headings. Let us say fasteners get covered under Chapter 73, seat get covered in 94, mats, switches. So if you see the structure of the tariff from right from Chapter 1 to 98, you'll see a progression. So it's not that a part of the car would not be covered under any other heading. You'll have, when you progress in the tariff, you'll have some goods coming under Chapter 84, 85, 73, 90, 94, and so on. So because of these two headings being there, there's a logical dispute, or I'll say there's a logical question which comes, that how do you determine the classification? And let me tell you, it's not a simple test which has been there, It has been a series of tests which Shivam would discuss later. But just to give you an idea, because of multiple classifications, the dispute commences. And again, as I told, the dispute, many clients, many MNC clients whom we deal with, they get surprised, or the foreign counterparts get surprised that such disputes are not there in other countries. Why are they here in India? The predominant reason is that there is a rate arbitrage. So if you see the BCD rate for 8708, 8714, that is usually 15%. And for other headings, that is 7.5 to 10%. So the first, if let us say you are an importer of auto parts, or let us say you are a manufacturer and import your input, a first logical question for the BCD rate, which has a direct cost impact, is whether the BCD rate would be higher or lower. Before proceeding here, I'll also like to point out one more thing. The government also, in order to avoid disputes, it's not that the government is not working towards that. It has been working consistently to avoid dispute. So what they have been doing is for other headings or other parts also, they are attempting that to increase the BCD rate from 7.5 to 15%. So just take an example of, let us say, a motor. Initially, there was this rate arbitrage, but now a motor which is suitable for motor vehicle, they have increased the rate, and the BCD rate for only these motors is 15%. And for other motors, so let us say motors would have, of course, motors is a very generic product and can have multiple uses. So for other motors, they have kept the rate BCD rate as the lower BCD rate only. So in that context, even after classification, this interplay of exemption notifications can be there. And just to provide a completeness for BCD rates, how this interplay works is that you'll even see for, let us say, not only 8708, but vis-a-vis other tariff items also. You'll see that in FTA benefits, or let us say country-specific benefits, you're importing some goods manufactured in Thailand, Japan, etc. You have different FTA for different HSNs. So in that context also, classification for determination of BCD becomes very, very relevant. The next difference is, the next difference is vis-a-vis the GST rate. The GST rate is 28% for these goods, and there's a very short list right now for which it attracts 28%. But for most of the other products, if they get classified somewhere else, their GST rate is 18%. The drawback rates differ. So for 8708, you have a higher drawback rate. For other goods, you have a lower drawback rate. So therein also a consistency is required, that let us say if you are an exporter, what classification do you adopt for your domestic goods and export goods? That should also be the same. And similarly, the road type roads also, depending upon the exact products, differ. But the overall idea is that it is not that most of the products attract same rate at one leg or the other. You'll have different rates which would get attracted. And just another point here, that it is not only these, sorry, it is not only that these rates would get attracted or would differ. There may be certain other implications also down the line vis-a-vis your supplier or the recipient, which may get triggered because of these different rates. Now, moving forward to, just now, this was the reason how this dispute starts. Another important point why this disputes have taken over importance in the recent past is also vis-a-vis the change in structure, specifically vis-a-vis the GST. And sorry, one just last point here I was concluding. We talked about these parts, SSCs, and other classification. There's another important category of, let us say, tractor manufacturers or tractor parts. So as in auto parts, tractor parts would also at different rates, being a priority sector for the government, may attract different rates at different parts, etc. Now coming on to the implications, why the implications, I'll say, have multiplied over the period of time is also because of the change in regime between excise and GST. So just take an example, let us say earlier excise duty rate was 6.5% or 12%. So there was, and for most of the goods, for these goods of disputes which we are talking about, the class excise duty rate was same only. Let us say 12.5%. So department never had a reason to challenge the domestic manufacturers. And after that rate, there was no, excise duty was the first point of levy, therefore there was no rate arbitrage. Same was the case for BCD also. But now with the GST rate changing and that having an impact at all the levels, the magnitude, firstly, you see the magnitude, 10%. Earlier, the magnitude, even if it was there for some products, that was much lower. And now from a single level, that has moved to all the levels across the supply chain. What this has done is this has increased the implications. Firstly, the multiplication of demands at different levels. So taking an example, and you are an OE part supplier who's supplying X product to OE. You may consider that, okay, I'm supplying this product to OE and department disputes, it would only be a dispute at my end. No, because OE would also, in some circumstances, be it for stock transfer, be it for his dealers, distributor, after sales, etc., he'll be selling the products further. that would attract an implication at your end and at an OEM level end. So there are multiplication of demands which have come post GST deals doing value added tax. And I think there should be some representation, or let us say some amendment from the department side, that let us say in this entire chain, if at one leg you have one leg, be it at the first leg or the last leg, if that dispute is raised, it should not trickle down to all levels. Secondly, for imports, it becomes all the more relevant. So usually for imports, because it's a cost, sometimes what happens is vis-a-vis domestic supply, it's a revenue neutral transaction. So it's easier for you to determine that, okay, let us err in the favor of revenue and pay a higher rate. But for imports, because it's a direct cost, that hits the P&L, that hits the bottom line. Then interest and penal implications. Often what happens is that, again, for at least a domestic transaction, you see these are revenue neutral transactions, and therefore there's no downside to following a higher rate, even for the retrospective period. But interest and penal implications are so huge that, and you must remember GST after 5 years. So if any demand was there since inception, you are almost looking at a 90% interest accumulation over the period of time. So the interest and penal implications are so huge that the assessees fear that the classification should not be correct. And lastly, another important point from the OEM perspective also, it's not that all for part manufacturers that supplies may be revenue neutral. But for OEM, because the goods would eventually go to the end customer, there would be a revenue impact or the pricing impact in after sales market, which would be inclusive of GST. So these are the implications that are there for correct or incorrect classification for two-wheeler parts or automobile parts. Yeah, sorry. The last point which we can also discuss is the ITC eligibility for the differential tax payment. That also gets dispute or challenge. And specifically, if let us say the department identifies and they say that it was a fraud and collusion at your end, then also the ITC eligibility to the recipient gets challenged. So the whole and soul of these implications is that it's very critical for you to get it first time right. In that context, now we'll be discussing some tests, recent developments for what have been there for these automobile part manufacturers. And for that, Shivam would take it up. Yeah, Shivam, please.
Thank you, Deepak. The custom tariff provide a general rule of interpretation, which are explaining the principles governing the classification. While reading that, you can determine the classification that is relevant. So rule 1 of general rule of interpretation provides that the title which are given under the custom tariff are just for reference, and the classification must be determined using the explanation given under heading, section, or chapter notes. So title you have to ignore. The classification will only be dependent upon the heading in the notes given under the tariff. Lastly, if the classification is not determinable from above factors, you will be moving on to other rules which are provided under the general rule of interpretations. Moving on specific to automobile industry, section 17 deals with vehicles which are used for transportation. It lays down certain tests which needs to be satisfied for a parts to be classified under this section. So there are 3 tests. First is it must not be excluded from note 2 of section 17. Illustrative list are that certain parts, example, vulcanized rubber, which are classified under heading 4016, will not be treated as parts and accessories under section 17. Secondly, parts of general use, which are notified as a part under section 15, shall be excluded from section 17 and it remain classified under section 15 only. There are other parts as well, example, chapter 85 products, chapter 91 products, which remain classified under specific heading only instead of classified as a part of section 17. Second test is that for classified under section 17, the particular product should be suitable for a particular vehicle only. It should not be generic product. For example, Deepak was discussing for motor. If a specific motor was can be used in multiple products, be it a vehicle or a machine itself, it cannot be classified under this chapter. It remains classified under this generic heading only. And lastly, it must not specifically be included elsewhere. For example, as Deepak was discussing that while reading all the chapters or headings, you will see that almost all the parts have a specific heading. So if any part has a specific inclusion in other category, you will move towards this specific heading rather than moving towards this secondary heading of parts.
Just explaining here what the specific heading means. So specific heading would be a more detailed reference by, you can say, a name. So these examples which we're taking, let us say a fastener, it is by name of screws specifically covered under the tariff in an erstwhile chapter, in chapter 73. So that reference would be there. But yes, a generic reference of that product, let us say a motor, a filter, etc. There are many examples of such reference of by name. But if let us say there is a generic or a more wider heading in that context, that would not cover. So let us say there is a heading of automatic regulators. So that would be a generic heading, and your product, which might be a category of that, it will not get excluded because that is not by name covered elsewhere. Right.
Moving on to the recent developments, as all of us are aware that Supreme Court in the case of Westinghouse laid down certain principles for classification. It firstly laid down that, as we discussed, Rule 1 specified that classification must be determined basis the heading and chapter notes. And if the headings and chapter notes are not sufficient enough to determine the classification, then we move towards the other rules. Westinghouse similarly discussed the same, which is correct. Westinghouse discussed, Supreme Court in the case of Westinghouse discussed that Note 3, which provides that the test of solely and principally to be used in a vehicle. They discussed that if any product or a part is solely and principally classified, is solely and principally is used for a particular vehicle, it remains classified as a part of such vehicle only rather than a different heading. Basis that test, the Supreme Court held that relays which are by specific name and by classification determinable under 8536 will be classified as a part of railway products under heading 8608. In our view, since the Supreme Court did not discuss all the three-layer tests that we earlier discussed, firstly, note to exclusion, solely and principally, and lastly, the nomenclature test. Since this relay product was satisfying, was failing to classify all, was failing to pass all the tests. In our view, the relay should be classified under 8536 only rather than 8608. Subsequently, review petition was also dismissed in this regard, since in this case, the assessee was benefited from this classification adopted by the department. The assessee was in benefit, but the principle that the Supreme Court adopted was totally incorrect. In this regard, CPIC also issued an instruction laying down the principle that this ruling is fact specific. Secondly, the applicability of this ruling will remain relevant for relays only rather than parts classified under Chapter 87, which governs parts of automobile industry. And lastly, since this ruling is fact specific, the individual classification for all the products which are there under Chapter 87 should be determined basis the other factors, which are the three tests, rather than going by the principle laid down in the judgment. Moving on to recent developments. So even after Westinghouse, there are certain judgments which lays down correct classification, ignoring the judgment given by Supreme Court, and laid down the correct classification by determining three-layer test. Speaking of which, classification of seat parts. In case of Cherokee Auto, the Supreme Court discussed that the seat parts, even if they are specifically designed for automobile products, even if they are not excluded specifically from Note 2, but since these seats or seat parts have a specific inclusion in specific heading of 9401 by way of nomenclature, these shall remain classified under 9401 only. As we earlier discussed that for classification, three-layer test is important. This seat parts, etc., seats and seat parts have a specific inclusion as a nomenclature under heading 9401. So by that basis, since it is failing one of the tests, the correct classification should be 9401 only.
Right. So just highlighting here that, so if let us say for your product also you want to apply this test, you should see that it should, these three tests, there should be in this case where we are highlighting red, there should be three reds for you to fall under 8708 or 8714. Even if you are able to say that one of the tests is not satisfied. So if let us say they are not specifically designed, or they are excluded by Note 2, or they are specifically covered elsewhere. Any one of the tests would also be sufficient for you to say these are not covered under 8708. And these tests are clearly coming in the explanatory notes to HSN, which was then adopted by the circular which Shivam discussed in the previous slide.
Yeah. Moving on to classification of switchboard cabinets. So the Advanced Ruling Authority, while determining the classification in the case of Prague polymers, discussed these three tests. And since all these three tests was not fulfilled, they classified the switchboard as under heading 8537 only. Gear parts, this is chat in the case of Hero Motocorp, discuss that these gear parts have a specific inclusion under section under as an electronic part under chapter 85. Secondly, note 2 specifically excludes articles of chapter 85 from its inclusion. So failing two tests will classify the gears products under the original category only under 8483 only, and the correct classification will be 8483.
For gear parts, again, it's one of the most trickiest classification which is there, which was in this case correctly determined by the tribunal. Because of the explanatory notes, gears of engine get covered under 8483 and other gears under 8708 or 8714. In this case, because the assessee was able to submit that the gears related to gears related of part which would form an integral part of engine, therefore this classification was correctly determined by the tribunal.
Lastly, recently the department is investigating that the classification of windshields, lamps, etc. should be under heading 8708 only. So in this case, we determine that since these windshields, lamp, etc. are specifically designed for motor vehicle, however, these windshield are specifically excluded by note 2. Why note 2? So correct classification should be under 8512 only, since note 2 specifically excludes article of chapter 85 from it. So even though chapter 85 does not specifically include windshields or lamps in its nomenclature, but even if failing one test, the classification should be under 8512 only.
And sorry, here again, one, if you see the trend is that the advanced rulings, tribunal, Supreme Court, even after Westinghouse, and these judgments we have taken, which have been pronounced after Westinghouse, even after that decision, they have, in that context, gone to the extent that the correct classification remains. And in that effect, followed to circular. But the department, and these were some sample products which we took, we know of many several products wherein they have been applying Westinghouse, if not by name, then at least by principle, and disputing the classification.
So, taking some example of certain products for which rulings were also given before Westinghouse itself by Supreme Court or tribunals, we'll be discussing certain parts. Firstly, electronic control unit, which is very relevant for recent EV industry. So in this product, Supreme Court in the case of Kehin Pharma discussed these tests and specifically discussed that ECU being product classified under 9032, since note 2 specifically exclude article of chapter 90 from its coverage, the correct classification should be under 9032 only. So 9032 specifically covers automatic regulators in its purview. So by name specifically, ECU are not governed from chapter 9032, but since note 2 test was failed, even if single test was failed, the Supreme Court discussed that the correct classification shall be 9032 only. Car mats, in the case of Uniproduct, the Supreme Court discussed that even if failing two tests specifically designed and note to exclusion, since these car mats are specifically covered under chapter 5700 article 5703, they shall remain classified under 5703 only. The Supreme Court discussed that it is relevant to taken care of the common parlance test as well, and since failing of one test will not remain classified under 8708, these articles shall remain classified under 5703 only. Yeah. For switch, in the case of Intel design, the Supreme Court discussed these tests and again laid down that these products shall classified under 8536 only. Importantly, the two judgments, Uni Products and Intel design, as we discussing earlier, that CBIC also issued an instruction that this judgment will not be relevant for chapter section 17 products. They specifically mentioned these two judgments, Uni Products and Intel design, and they discussed that in these two products that all these tests are failed, the correct classification will be under specific heading only rather than the residuary heading. So Even after Supreme Court judgment under Westinghouse, the CBIC has officially accepted these two judgments, which was correctly laid down the principles of classification. For safety glass, again, the tribunal in the case of Chandra Lakshmi discussed that since these safety glass, etc., specifically covered under 7007 heading only, the classification remain under that only and rather than 8708 as a part of motor vehicle. Moving on to some negative judgments. So as Deepak was discussing fastness classification. So GS Auto in the case of GS Auto while determining the fastness classification, the Supreme Court discussed that even though note to exclusion was there, they discussed that since this fastness are specifically designed for vehicles only, they similarly to Westinghouse they discussed that note 3 will prevail over note 2, and since these fasteners are specifically designed for automobile industry, it shall remain classified under 8708 only. In our view, just GS Auto did not discuss correctly the principle laid down by the classification. Since these fasteners are specifically designed, even if they are specifically designed, they are excluded from note 2. Lastly, fasteners, nuts, and bolts specifically covered as a nomenclature under 7318. So, failing two tests shall classify these products under 7318 only rather than 8708.
Here, another important point for GS Auto is that even though they discuss note 2, and we have to accept that once discussed, the judgment of Supreme Court would hold, the third test at least was not discussed. So the SIC did not submit the fact that they were also covered elsewhere by nomenclature. So that is a sufficient, I'll say, point for distinction in this case.
While determining classification of nameplate, Supreme Court in the case of Pragati Silicon similarly discussed the test and laid down that incorrectly laid down that since these nameplates are not specifically covered under chapter 38926 under heading 3926, they shall remain classified under 8708 only. However, they did not discuss the inclusion provided under Note 2. Note 2 specifically provides that articles of plastics which are similarly designed and excluded as a part of general use under section 15 shall remain excluded as well. And these nameplates, etc., are specifically covered as articles or parts of general use under section 15. So by that basis, they should be classified under 3926 only. And the Supreme Court incorrectly held these as parts of vehicles in this case. Premier instrument, the Supreme Court discussed similar test and laid down the classification as 7308 only. In this case also, since these instruments clusters are specifically not by name but by principle covered under 9031 heading, exclusion was there under note 2 of article covered under chapter 90. These should be remained as a 9032 only.
And under GST, in fact, for instrument clusters, and for that matter, for nameplates, there's another product, MNUMs. Instrument clusters would attract multiple other, I'll say, defenses also. So the one of the principles that the Supreme Court discussed was that it's a combination of multiple parts. And under GST, you can consider whether the composite supply concept would then come into picture or not. So again, GST, while it would have some different tests, might also lead to an additional defense in this regard.
So as we were discussing that three rates will correctly lay down the principle that product will be classified under 8708 only. For example, brakes. Brakes are specifically designed for automobile industry. They're not specifically excluded from note 2. And lastly, there is no specific heading governing brakes. So since failing these three tests, classification of brakes should be 8708 only. There are some judgments classifying brake pads, etc. But yes, by principle, brakes should be classified under 8708 only, failing all these three layer tests. Yeah. So we ran a poll as well, wherein we asked that whether you feel confident of the classification adopted by you. So we got similar response as well, that 50% of the taxpayer feel that their classification is not incorrect, is not correct. So by that basis, even if the classification principle is from there since 1975, even now the department or the taxpayers are not confident on their classification. That may impact their working capital and on the implications that we discussed. Yeah. Now we will be discussing the way forward. Deepak will discuss the same.
Thank you. So thank you, Shivam. And going to the way forward, I think that it's more, I'll say, be cautious approach that, and this would apply not only to automobile parts, but to all the parts, let us say. So number one, for imports, you should be extra cautious and you should have a detailed classification. And even if you are confident on the classification, have a recheck on the BCD rates because of the different notifications which exist, that the BCD rate for the products or even IGST rate, if the classification might differ, is correct or not. And as I mentioned, even for tractors, let us say the classification may be correct, but the rates are different. So this detailed exercise, because of the multiple factors involved, is needed. Secondly, for domestic supplies, at output stage, you should have a classification review, specifically wherein the possibility of two rates is there. So what some auto part companies have been doing is, if let us say there is a higher rate which they have been adopting, they're fine because department cannot challenge. But wheresoever the rate adopted by them is at a lower slab, they are getting the same vetted or verified in that context. A third, I'll say, smart approach which the auto part companies have been considering is that if let us say they know, and again, I'll say the information in this information is the information spread. So if they know that there is something which might attract a dispute from the department for their product, or let us say there is a negative judgment which is there in the erstwhile law which does not support their present classification, they are considering to paying the tax under protest, at least for future. So for future, there will be no interest implications. You pay tax, the recipient gets the credit. But again, it would be a long drawn process wherein you analyze it, if, or let us say you feel a risk and then you adopt this approach. Secondly, a similar approach is that for this classification exercise, it would be good that if you have any positive ruling of the erstwhile law also, which would then take support from CBIC circular and state that the correct classification of the lower rate adopted is correct. Then, if let us say for revenue neutral transaction, in case you decide to pay a higher rate, you'll need to communicate with the customers to adopt this higher rate. And there has to be, because again, no one works in isolation. There's the entire structure wherein you are working, wherein you customers, vendors are all partners. So that entire channel would need to be taken into confidence for any change. If let us say the customers do not agree, you may also consider for requesting for indemnity for non-payment of tax, or in that case, considering for past or for future, if let us say that in case of dispute specifically, that rate gets changed. And lastly, and very importantly, I think link of representations before CBIC or GST Council. So what we see the CBIC issuing a circular is a result of the is a result of many representations that were filed. But if for an incorrect judgment, if there have been cases wherein the judgment has been incorrect, let us say of AAAR or any other judgment, or the department does not agree, it would make sense for a product specific also representations being filed and judgments be placed before the relevant council or CBIC, so that they are able to give a clarification one-to-one or for general public, which would benefit the industry at large. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining in such large numbers and such an interactive session. Looking forward.
Thank you.